My pleasure to, good evening, everybody. My pleasure to welcome you to tonight's talk by our much beloved committee member, Frankie Kane. Frankie Kane is absolutely the man to talk about Charlotte Brooke. Some of us, I think probably many of us would be vaguely aware of her existence and vaguely aware that her publication of the Reliques of Irish Poetry in 1789, and there's a significant year, had significance in the rescuing of the Irish language. But since childhood, Frankie has been absorbed by Charlotte Brooke because, lo and behold,
okay, we seem to have lost John there. For some reason, I don't know what happened. But I'll throw it over to you, Francis and I, okay?
Well, lo and behold, here I am. Thanks very much, everyone, for joining me this evening. I wouldn't claim any great expertise in Charlotte Brooke, but I think what John was about to tell you is that due to the fact that an ancient first edition copy of the book has been a family heirloom, I actually grown up with the book and read it very innocently as a child, and really didn't know much about it at all, or its significance until much later in adulthood. With the coming of the internet, I kind of realized that we had a very rare and very astonishing book by a extremely talented and quite mysterious woman called Charlotte Brooke. And Charlotte is the main focus of tonight's talk. I humbly want to try to do some justice to her. Not that I think other people haven't done justice to her. I just think that she is still an untapped well of astonishing connections. She, in some ways, she's like the quiet, humble center of a storm of ideas that were swirling around in Ireland in the 1780s in particular. Okay, thanks for bearing with me. So the Enlightenment of Charlotte Brooke. The first slide is just showing one of those rather typically satirical cartoons that were produced in London in the 1780s, 1790s. This isn't actually Gilray, this is a guy called Kane. And the title here is Mrs. John Bull, the wife of John Bull. Is this lady called Hibernia, and there she is playing the harp. I don't know if you're able to see the whole screen, but she has a baby on her back. She's wearing a bonnet. It's not a particularly kind image of Ireland, but at the same time, it's not particularly cruel either. Anyway, enough about Dighton's cartoon. Here is a picture of a young woman from the late 18th century, but this isn't Charlotte Brooke. This is actually Maria Edgeworth. Maria Edgeworth is extremely famous and significant writer and thinker in her own right. And part of tonight's talk concerns the struggle of women. You know, I'm a little bit uncomfortable talking about the struggle of women, having no expertise in women's studies, but it's obvious to any human being that was very tough for women in the late 18th century just to be regarded as equal. So this great woman, Maria Edgeworth, who, by the way, anecdotally, we can say probably knew Charlotte Brooke. They moved in the same circles. They had the same interests. They were contemporaries. You know, due to a kind of general paucity of written records about Charlotte, or there's no image of her or anything. I'm showing you this image really just to show you what a young woman dressed like at that time, what a woman from that part of Ireland at that time looked like. Now, the point about Maria, the friend of Charlotte, is Maria was a bit of a genius too. And at the tender age of 74 years of age, Maria was finally admitted into the Royal Irish Academy. The kind of, I suppose, the leading authority for Irish academic matters, which was founded in the mid-1780s by people that Charlotte Brooke was very familiar with. By people who Charlotte Brooke was by far the intellectual superior of, and yet Charlotte wasn't even allowed to apply to the academy. Just after she published her book, you know, she fell into poverty, and in extreme circumstances, she desperately went to the academy to try to get a humble job as a housekeeper. This would have given her some security, would have given her a roof over her head and a modest income, very modest income, but they turned her down. You know, Charlotte Brooke, in my humble opinion, a true original, a genuine genius, was left out to rot, and she died young a couple of years later. Anyway, aside from the tragedy of her life, we'll be hearing something about her actual work. You know, we'll be talking about what she actually produced. But maybe more important, maybe more dear to our hearts, is Charlotte's role in what we think of as the Enlightenment. Okay, that might be a little bit controversial because most scholars don't think of Charlotte Brooke as an Enlightenment figure. They think of her really as a pioneer of romantic and emotional, passionate kind of art work, which can be interpreted as a reaction against the Enlightenment. But my point would be that Charlotte wasn't just about literature. She had all of these really quite unique philosophical and political ideas about the relationship between Britain and Ireland. She was really quite a dreamer and really quite enlightened in her thinking around her work. So that's what I mean when I describe Charlotte Brooke as an Enlightenment figure. I don't mean in terms of literature, I mean in terms of thought, in terms of political thinking. Political thinking, Charlotte Brooke, yes, but her political thinking is performed in such a subtle and consciously humble and gentle way that it's maybe not immediate. What she's actually saying is quite revolutionary. Not violent revolutionary, but revolutionary nevertheless. Okay, let's move on. That's Maria Edgeworth. So the book that we're mainly talking about is Relics of Irish Poetry. You can see there part of the front page. There's a photograph I took earlier today of a copy of the book. The copy of the book that is a family heirloom. Okay, well, you know, the main sources on Charlotte Brooke's life are Charles Henry Wilson's Brookeana, 1804, and Aaron Crossley Seymour's Memoirs of Miss Brooke, which was an appendix to the second edition of the book, which was published quite a bit later in 1816. It's from Seymour that we read about Charlotte's childhood, and I'm fascinated by potentially what was going on in Charlotte's childhood. Charlotte grew up on a big estate in County Cavan. The Brooke family, the famous Brooke family, the same Brooke family of Donegal and Tyrone, the Brooke family that turn up throughout Irish history and indeed British history. That's the family background of Charlotte. And Seymour tells us that, you know, Charlotte could read any book by the age of 5. So just think about that for a quick moment. She could read any book by the age of 5. We also hear that she was into gardening. She memorized a lot of English poetry. And this comment, the accomplishments generally attained with labour, expense, and waste of time, seemed with her the mere amusement of a few spare hours, and required with little expense or professional assistance. If this is true, and we've no real reason to believe it isn't, these are statements describing a statistical outlier, a human being of unusual gifts, no matter what her family background. A quick comment on what I find so potentially fascinating about her childhood. It's the fact that on the landed estate, the workers were the ordinary Gaelic-speaking people of the mid-18th century. So the farm labourers were Gaelic-speaking, and the Brooke family, Charlotte's dad, you know, they were quite a cultured and kind of outward-looking, friendly Christian ascendancy family with quite tolerant attitudes. And Charlotte spent time as a child in the company of the Irish labourers, and she, it's reported that she heard one of them reading from a manuscript in a kind of a song style to the others, and this excited her interest. Now, I just, we just don't know how immersed Charlotte ever was in Irish, whether she was orally proficient, you know, whether it was part of her existence in her social life, you know, in her contacts with people we know so little about, the ordinary Gaelic people, the vast majority of Irish people at that time, the forgotten mass of impoverished, generally speaking, Gaelic-speaking citizens of the country. Okay, right. Let's see what the next slide shows us. I've actually forgotten. Oh, yes. This is a minor curiosity. It's a letter from the British Museum, dated 1896, found in the book. It describes the book as having some value. Some more graffiti from my book. This is from the late 19th century. Harps, crosses, and shamrocks, God Save Ireland, and Home Rule. I don't know who wrote this graffiti. Possibly an ancestor of mine. Here is the Brooke family tree. I don't propose to go into any great detail about the genealogy, but you know, there are some very important and famous people, even just on this page. By the 20th century, we have the likes of Peter Brooke, the late 80s, early 90s Northern Ireland secretary, member of the Tory cabinet. So, you know, the Brooke family are remarkable in that respect. And I read a little bit about this family, and I wanted to know if they had a copy of the book, and they do. They have a copy of Charlotte's book, but apparently it's in extremely poor condition. This is Henry Brooke, Charlotte Brooke's father. He was a famous playwright. Charlotte was completely dedicated to him during his life. He believed in bringing up children without coercion. So Charlotte herself gives huge credit, outlandishly huge credit. She basically says everything that she is and everything that she cares about is because of him and dedicated to him. I don't propose to do any kind of psychological analysis of this. Just to comment that after her father died in the early 1780s, Charlotte was alone. Alone and potentially impecunious, skint, you know. So the comment I want to make is that I think it was in her interest to try to live off the reputation of her father. It was possibly, in addition to being a very sincere dedication she had to him, I think, you know, had she not got this famous playwright of a father who's connected to society so much, it would have been even harder for her to demonstrate her own talents and to get anywhere in the world, really. Okay, so Relics of Irish Poetry followed the publication of Relics of Ancient English Poetry. And this was very much the model for Charlotte. The ancient English poetry was published in the 1760s. It's curious that there is a harp on the cover. I can't explain a harp on the cover of the ancient English poetry, I'm afraid. Okay. Now let's go straight into something that connects Charlotte to the United Irishman. Though not in life. Charlotte had died before this happened. 2 years after she died, some of her work was published by the Northern Star, by the United Irishman, by Russell, Vulcan Solar, the Gaelic magazine. This is, well, the fact that this happened is something reasonably well known to those of us who are interested in the United Irishman. The point about Vulcan Solar is that it has an Irish grammar and some little dialogues and some vocabulary. And really, we get the feeling from the preface that what the United Irishmen were up to was trying to find a way to communicate with Gaelic speakers so that the movement of United Irishmen so that people could actually talk to each other, understand each other. You know, when you think about this, it's a really odd situation. The fact that the English speakers of Ireland generally couldn't understand what the ordinary people were saying, and therefore couldn't understand anything about their culture or what they held dear. This was a bilingual magazine. Well, again, you know, there are things that we can say about this, which well, I'll tell you what. I'll leave it to Russell to speak for us. So, Russell, seeing that the Gaelic has been not only banished from the court, the college, and the bar, but that many tongues and pens have been employed to cry it down and to persuade the ignorant that it was harsh and barbarous jargon, and that their ancestors, from whom they derived it, were an ignorant, uncultivated people, it becomes then necessary to say something in reply. So, you know, Russell is defending not just the language, but the people and their ancestors and the if you like, the civilization, the forgotten civilization of the Irish. So in saying this, you know, Russell is not at odds at all with what Charlotte Brooke herself says. Which kind of leads me, and I hope this isn't too much of a tangent. Yeah, I think I'll just go back. Just to say a little, a word about Ireland at this time. As we all know, Ireland in the 1780s, this is the time of Grattan's Parliament. And we have this highly unusual period in Irish history when loyal subjects of the crown were also constitutional nationalists. So a lot of constitutional nationalism going on in Ireland in the 1780s. And yet it wasn't disloyal to the king. It was, I wouldn't say disloyal to England, but merely asserting independence from the British Parliament, but still very loyal to the king. So constitutional nationalists were loyalists in the 1780s. And the big issue of the time really was the rights of Catholics, the position of Catholics in the Irish polity. So it's probably, you probably know Grattan and the constitutional nationalists were largely sympathetic to liberating the majority population and bringing them into the public discourse, political representation, having representation in the parliament and so on. And loads of efforts were made to achieve this enlightened aim, but they all failed, of course. And as they failed, this merely fed the physical force Republicans, if we want to call the United Irishman that. I suppose we can. I don't think it's inaccurate to describe the United Irishmen as physical force Republicans. but to describe many of their opponents to be actually constitutional nationalists stroke loyalists. So it's a completely different time, a completely different paradigm going on in the politics. And generally we would accept that most of the dissent, most of the physical force, most of those ideas, with Wolfe Tone leading them, those ideas were more popular amongst Northern Presbyterians and, if you like, the natives, rather than the gentry or the well-to-do or the people of the Church of Ireland. The point I'm making is it's a very rich soup of ideas, and it's very unstable, and there are people wavering within this paradigm. Now, under no circumstances am I making any claim whatsoever that Charlotte had any interest at all in having a violent revolution. There's absolutely no evidence for that. But in her writings, we read a lot about her desire to demonstrate the military fame and the, if you like, the prowess in battle and war of the Irish civilization. Very gentle, very humble lady, no suggestions of political revolution. Far from it. She was appealing for respect and understanding and intelligence and sensitivity. She was appealing to the higher nature of human beings. For play to her for doing so. Now, what else can I tell you? Well, perhaps you'd like to know that Charlotte Brooke's work is, of course, extremely important in the history of folklore studies and the Gaelic revival. Massive significance. In some ways, it's the source, it's the well from which a lot of work sprang. Douglas Hyde, founder of the Gaelic League, big definer of the Irish nation is a Gaelic nation. The Irish language needed to be revived in order for the Irish people to have a nationhood. This is in the 1890s. Douglas Hyde points out that Charlotte Brooke was the first person to use the word Fenian. And chuckle, Fenian. Fenian's a very problematic word for Irish scholars. I'm aware of that. But I actually looked in Charlotte's book to check that. Was Douglas Hyde right? Did Charlotte use the word Fenian? She uses the word Fenian to describe the followers of Finn McCool. She doesn't really talk about Fenians. She talks about Fenians. So I'm sure you're delighted to know that. Okay, so what does the book look like? We'll have a look there. You can see the Irish, the script. The typeface is highly unusual. It's unique. It's incredible. Not been seen before. Although I'll word about that in a moment. This is the the first thing that we see in the Irish in the book. and this is the epic poem, Hamloch. Hannah Culloch coherent, Culloch coming to Ireland. We'll just talk a little bit about this actual poem, just for a moment, just to kind of throw some light on the subject. I very humbly don't want to pretend that I've got any great expertise in Irish. Got a bit of Irish, but I'm very blessed with my brother. Peter Brooke is fully bilingual, and I asked my brother to take a look at Culloch here, and sure enough, my brother was able to translate it very easily. Although he did point out that the script is unusual and some of the vocabulary is a little bit archaic, but at the same time, this is a form of modern Irish. Now, I'm sorry, excuse me. Sorry, I want to show you more about Culloch. Yeah, so here on the left there you can see Charlotte's translation of those first few lines. So, Culloch, haughty, bold and brave, rides upon Erin's wave, flushed with loud applauding fame. From Dunskake's walls he came to visit Erin's coast, came to prove her mighty host. You can hear what's going on there, and there's no possible way that's a literal translation of the Irish, not with all that rhyming and all that cadence, all that meter. So the translation that Peter gave me was the abrupt hero, and the word there for abrupt, slightly difficult to translate the actual meaning, a kind of a quick acting, somebody who doesn't hesitate to do something. Hero, the brave champion Culloch came from Dunskache to Ireland. Skache, Peter and I were talking earlier, we think that's probably related to Scaffa, from Holland's teacher who lived in Scotland. So we think this is the fort of Scaffa. Culloch was Cuchulain's son. Welcome to you, our hero, now that you have come from the lands of the east of the world, beautiful hero of glittering weaponry. And I would point out that the style of the Irish, very kind of visceral and unpretentious, not rhymy floriness, but just really straightforward, totally honest. Welcome to you, no guile, no kind of double speak. Very straightforward praise in the original Irish. So a little bit more of Charlotte's there underneath Peter's. Welcome, O youth of the intrepid, whatever that is. I can't actually say, in glittering armor blessed. Okay, so what we're seeing is that Charlotte is not translating the Irish literally. She's creating this English poetry, which is, in her own words, a paraphrase of the Irish rather than a direct word-for-word translation. Again, just pause for thought, just for a moment to think about that. If you are paraphrasing something, it means you're going for the soul of it. You're trying to express the heart of the matter, the point of the matter. And really, in order to paraphrase, you really need quite high level of skill beyond just being able to translate the words. So paraphrasing, I would suggest, is actually a higher skill than merely translating word for word. Charlotte is at pains throughout the book to explain her approach and to humbly apologize for any of her failings, and to constantly paint herself as the gentle, kind female who knows her place and merely wishes to try her best. And to me, this is a kind of a ploy. This is her emotional intelligence. She's reaching out to that English-speaking audience. She doesn't want to affront them too much. She doesn't want them to be shocked by all this military talk of the Irish. Who? The Irish military? You know, we're talking about peasants in the dirt having this big military civilization. You know, I think Charlotte was conscious not to affront or shock her audience too much, and part of that was her hiding her gifts behind this talk of being only a weak and feeble girl who couldn't possibly be doing everything right, and terribly sorry for all her mistakes and so on. You know, when you read stuff like that, you feel kind of charmed, but also you can't help but feel a little tinge of fury on behalf of Charlotte, that she was in that kind of position where she had to adopt that kind of approach just in order to get published, to get heard, and to be taken seriously. Right? And I think she can be taken very seriously. I suppose I should say, although she was in declining health and very poor circumstances, by 1792 she published a selection of her father's writings in 3 volumes. She prefaced the work with a memoir of her father and a defense of his reputation as a writer, you know, which by that time was fading. She also published a direct and simple presentation of Christian doctrine for children, a kind of educational philosophy, using her father's approach. The School for Christians in Dialogue for the use of children. Okay, right. I think actually I probably need to go back a bit, yes. Okay, so I've talked about Conloch and the different translating styles. And Conloch is this epic military poem, and Conloch is coming from Scotland into Ireland. And there's a huge misunderstanding. Conloch doesn't realise who he is, and the Irish don't realise who he is, and a whole lot of people get killed by Conloch. A whole lot of Irish champions gets ended by Conloch before Conloch himself is finally ended. So, you know, typical Irish stuff, really, really desperate, desperately sad in the end. Quick tangent. I also want to humbly thank the encyclopedic Stephen McCracken, our very own Stephen, who's with us this evening. Stephen, as we all know, is a real expert of the United Irishman. He's got a head full of names and places, people, stories. And one of the things that we've been interested in together is to look at the subscribers list in Charlotte Brooke's book. there are lists of subscribers in the first edition and also in the 1816 edition. Again, I really just want to touch on this tonight because I think this is potentially a whole wormhole of study for someone. Well, for me, for you, for anybody who cares to do it. I think when we look at the names on these subscribers lists, we start to look into who these people are and who they're connected to, and we get this picture of Charlotte's connections, the people she was able to persuade to put up money so she could publish her book, and we find that most of them are very well-to-do, landed gentry, aristocratic people, cardinals in Rome, MPs, political people. What Stephen and I have been looking for, of course, are United Irishmen, or indeed United Irishwomen. If you look at what I'm showing you now, there's a name there, George Tandy. George Tandy, Esquire. We can't be certain, but that might be Napa Tandy's brother George. But again, it says George Tandy, Esquire. It doesn't tell us which George Tandy, Esquire. And there was a printing family, Tandy, in Dublin, and it could well be him. There, further down the page, we see Colonel Charles Valancy. To scholars of the, not so much scholars of the Irish language, scholars of the Irish revival, Valancy's name would be quite well known. I'm not sure what to say about Valancy. I don't want to say too much about him. He'd be very important to Charlotte because he was kind of a senior authority on the importance of Irish literature at that time. But his own academic ideas were a bit mad. He was an Orientalist, he believed there was a Phoenician and Carthaginian origin for Irish, and that there was a connection between Irish mythology and legends and the Middle East. There were others who thought this way at that time, but really, what I like about Charlotte is that she's really grateful, humbly admiring of this man for his help, but she doesn't buy everything he says, hook, line, and sinker. She retains a gentle kind of circumspection, and so Valancy is probably worth mentioning. Okay. Now, I want to quickly say something about harp music and Irish poetry. I think we should appreciate the intimate connection and sometimes an inseparable connection between the music and the song. Wonderfully and fantastically, Charlotte gave us a translation of Gracie Nugent by Carolyn. Carolyn was a poet and Carolyn was a harper, the great poet, the great harper, Carolyn. And let's not go on too much about Carolyn, but there's Charlotte's translation of Gracie's charms enraptured will I sing, fragrant and fair as blossoms of the spring. To her sweet manners and accomplished mind, each rival fair the balm of love resigned, and so on. It's lovely, isn't it? Really, the romantic style. Now, what's really interesting about Charlotte when she writes about Carolyn. There's Carolyn's poem in Charlotte's book, but that's how we see it in Relics of Irish Poetry. And I've just shown you her English translation, but she goes a bit further than that. She feels the need to be literal. I'm so sorry. Okay, that's my fault. I've got my slides mixed up. You can see that here, Charlotte, after getting her floral, and remember what I said earlier, she's really writing for an English-speaking audience and also a certain type of mentality audience. But in this case, in the case of Carolyn and Gracie Nugent, she can't resist giving a literal translation. And this is wonderful to see, because here we see, it wasn't that she couldn't translate literally, it wasn't that she wasn't interested in the literal translation. And we can see her literal translation is lovely and direct and very parallel, very Irish, very, most Irish people will feel the Irishness of expressions like that, her side like alabaster and her neck like a swan and her countenance like the sun in summer, that type of thing. Sweet and pleasant is your lovely conversation, bright and sparkling your blue eyes. And every day do I hear all tongues declare your praises and how gracefully your bright tresses wave down your neck. Again, in the direct translation of Irish, we hear this kind of guile, this unpretentiousness, this kind of, feeling of, I'm not lying here, when I tell you how totally beautiful you are, this type of thing. It's a kind of an Irish quality that's difficult to put into English. Okay. I'm so sorry, I have got my slides mixed up. I was dreading I would do this, but hopefully I'll be able to say what I'm talking about, what's on the screen. Yeah, this is Charlotte talking about the music, as I was alluding to earlier. The Harp Festival of 1792 in Belfast included Gracie Nugent by Carolyn, the tune, as opposed to the poem. So I guess that's the main point I want to leave with us about that. I think we should understand that Charlotte was contributing even to the Harp Festival, or at least to the milieu around the Harp Festival. But here she is talking about music, and she writes, I'm not sufficiently conversant in the state of the ancient music of this country to say what that might once have been or what degree of change it might have suffered. But it does not appear to me that the ancient poetry of Ireland was ever composed in a very lively strain. What does she mean? I by no means would assert that this is certainly the case, for as yet I am but young in researches. I only conceive of probability of it being so, from I never having met with an instance to the contrary. What she's talking about is the plaintiveness, the sadness, the deep, sublime, sorrowful beauty that we would all recognize in Irish music. And she's pointing out that the same thing is in the poetry. So in her experience, she's saying the music and the poetry isn't joking. It's not trying to be funny. And fair play to her, you know. I'm not claiming that that's the be all and the end all of Irish poetry, but just the fact that we have this brilliant young mind thinking these things and understanding and observing these things and trying to interpret what they actually mean about the Irish is the really interesting thing. I thought you might be interested to hear her compare the arts of Ireland, France, and England. Again, I remind everybody, this is the 1780s. Ireland, France, England, 1780s. Anyway, she's praising the English as having more of the vivacity, or not having the vivacity of the Gallic muse, the French muse, but infinitely excel the Gallic muse in all that tends to constitute the vital spirit of poetry. So she's saying that English poetry is better than French poetry. And then she says, in Ireland, this fascinating art was still more universally in practice and still more enthusiastically admired. The muse was here the goddess of unbounded idolatry, and her worship was the business of life, the business of life. Poetry. Our Irish bards are in the fine frenzy of exalted thought. We're lost to that play of fancy which only sports with freedom when it is not interrupted by the heart or awed to silence by the sublime conceptions of the soul. She goes on, fancy is, in general, the vehicle of wit, imagination that of genius. The happiest thoughts may flow in the most harmonious and highly adapted measure without one spark of poetic fire. At least one half of those who bear the title of English poets are merely men of wit and rhyme. What is she saying? Very subtly, very gently, very cleverly, very spectacularly. She's saying, look, yeah, the French are good, the English are better, but the Irish wipe the floor with a lot of you when it comes to poetic fire. So Charlotte's interested in the fire, the passion, the romance, and again, just remind you what I said earlier about the Enlightenment period and moving into the Romantic period in the arts. Charlotte's right there. She's really quite a big, interesting mix of all of that. Oh, yes, there's the page where you can see the word Fenian. Okay, just to prove my point. Charlotte doesn't use the word Fenian, she uses the word Fenian. Okay. I'll go back and I think I have a few. I think actually I'll move to draw things to a close because time has always marched on, and as always I have leathered on. I actually did. I wrote a little paragraph here that I read to you so that I don't leather too much. I want to just say a little bit about the Enlightenment, Charlotte. You know, scholars of Celtic studies, scholars, Gaelic scholars, point out Charlotte's contribution to asserting the Irishness of Irish culture and undermining, if not fully debunking, Macpherson and the Ossianic controversy. So, you know, on an academic level, Charlotte made a huge contribution. It wasn't until later in the 19th century, but Macpherson was finally completely debunked. But Charlotte began the process, and she was outraged, I think, by Macpherson claiming these kind of Caledonian heroes of Irish poetry who didn't really exist. But I don't really want to speak about Macpherson. I want to say this. Okay. When we look back at the Enlightenment from a European perspective, that is not from a Chinese perspective or an African perspective, but from a European perspective, we find that by the mid-18th century, there's very little coherence to the Enlightenment as a whole. We find that the search for truth is very much on. And a lot of truth is found in science and technology and economic exploitation and travel and trade and so on. But what, for example, is the connection between science, technology, government, and human rights, beauty, morals, the arts? Was that connection ever found? I'm not sure it ever was. But we can say that it was looked for. People were looking for this ultimate artistic enlightenment too. We cannot point to a single set of beliefs and say that's the Enlightenment. That is to say, science, reason, economic exploitation, and new technologies. These were one kind of Enlightenment direction, while philosophy, politics, ethics, and the arts were really quite something else in the end, something much more complicated, much more subject to culture, identity, systemic inequalities, and the power struggles and personalities of politics and tradition. In Ireland in the 1780s, there was a great deal of what can be understood by the modern mind as constitutional nationalism among the very same people we might also accurately term as loyal subjects of the king at the time. Although there was plenty of bitter sectarianism all over Europe in the 1780s, in Ireland, obviously and undeniably, there was also a huge struggle, both constitutionally and treasonously, to end this sectarianism. You know, this is over 200 years ago, a serious attempt to end the thing that we still live with today. In the 1790s, Irish nationalism fragmented between those loyal to the crown and those who became violent physical force revolutionaries. The major moral, philosophical, and political issue was to do with rights, specifically the rights of Catholics and the rights of dissenters. The famous Irish Parliament at that time failed to cohere, failed to grant rights, failed to extend representation, and abolished itself. Politically, in the decades after that, again, as we all know, the sectarianism in Irish politics did not abate, and it eventually arrived at the dystopian sense of permanent tribal hostility and permanent identity crisis that has come to define, or at least came to define, Northern Ireland for a long time as a complete throwback anachronism, a kind of a hideous daily reenactment of 17th century attitudes. But the point is, not 18th century attitudes. They were much more fluid. We had this period of instability and fluidity, which we claim the Enlightenment is extremely interested in from all angles. Now, we cannot know how deep Charlotte Brooke's personal identification went with the Gaelic-speaking peasantry and their mysterious language. But I want to say this. Here we have an Ulster ascendancy woman defining the Irish nation. She defines it as a Gaelic entity. And she defines herself as a member of it. And she appeals to everyone in Ireland to join this nation, which is Gaelic. Right. This is such a revolutionary, profound thing to be doing. She does it quietly and humbly, but it's there. she defines the Irish nation pretty much for the first time in that way. She thinks of the Irish nation as female and the Irish muse as female, although she does go on a lot about the masculine strength and military prowess and so on. Right. At the time, the fluidity and romanticism in her writing would have actually been seen as highly stylish and innovative and quite hip and wicked at that time. So she has even been called the first of the Irish Romantic writers. Not just the first to translate Irish, but the first ever Irish Romantic writer. Ní Wingala, in her wonderful 2009 edition, available to everyone, digital edition available online, published 2009. Leslie Wingala, a wonderful piece of work. It's through Ní Wingala that I make the connection with Maria Edgeworth. Yeah, what can I say? We've really reached the end of the time. I do have plenty more to say about her, maybe another time, but I'll leave it there for now and just encourage everyone to, when it's convenient for you, if you have a mind, if you have the curiosity, Google Charlotte Brooke, Relics of Irish Poetry, and have a little dabble, have a little read for yourself and a little think for yourself about what's going on with this amazing woman and her amazing mind. Okay. Thank you very much, everyone. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Francis. That was brilliant. I think everybody learned a wee bit, has a greater knowledge now of what Charlotte really brought to the table back then. If you don't mind me asking, she seems to have brought this book out and gathered this information in her twilight years. What did she do before that?
Oh, well, we believe that she was probably born in the 1750s. So there's been a revision of her age. She was the youngest of 22 kids. So while her father was alive, she was completely dedicated to him. He died 1783, Stephen. So at that time, she probably would have been about 30-ish, late 20s, maybe. And what was she doing? You know, she was living that kind of Bronte sister life. She was living in the big house, studying. And maybe, as I like to imagine, she was also spending time on the estate, listening to poetry and talking Irish. She led that kind of life until the family fell into hard times. The dad had to sell the estate and they all moved to Longford. Really, Stephen, I would say she was probably not even 40 when she died, or maybe about 40 when she died. And it was in her 30s that she did all of this work.
I'm sorry about that there.
Yeah, in addition to the the scholarly work she did, she also ran a charitable school. You know, she, like her own great ancestor, Mary Ann McCracken, Charlotte Brooke was just interested in charity. She interested in education and children. So that's what she was up to, Stephen.
What did she die of, if you don't mind me asking?
Malignant fever, whatever that means. I presume some kind of horrible infection. Malignant fever. Yeah.
Right on. Mark Dougherty asked a question here. Frank, do you know how your family acquired the book?
There are stories that I think it's maybe not appropriate for me to share them in this public platform. But Mark, I'd be very happy to chat with you about that off-piste. But it wouldn't be the case that ancient O'Cahans on the ancient estate got the book, much as my brother and I would love that to be the case. We'd love it to be the case that it was actually our own family who were speaking the Irish on the estate. But no, I don't think so. Basically, I think it came into the family through Gaelic scholarship. I think there was Gaelic scholarship in our family. Yeah.
So yours was the first edition, is that right?
Yes, yes. It's from what I understand, there are a handful of these things left in the world in decent condition. So the one in our private hands is extremely rare. A handful of first edition books, they tend to be kept in public libraries, museums. They're obviously very precious. I do need to say something before we all go. It's really important, I think, to recognize that Charlotte was not exactly the first person to do this translating in print. A few years before Charlotte, a few poems were published by a man called Wilson, who was connected with Charlotte. Yeah, so I'm going a bit off track, but basically, yes, this book is the first substantial work printed in Gaelic and Irish, so it's very rare.
Okay, James Ward asked a wee question here, Francis, if you don't mind carrying on a wee bit longer. How much of a conflict would you see between Romantic and Enlightenment ideologies? Does Brooke's vision help reconcile them?
Oh, wonderful question. Yes, I really appreciate that question. Very juicy indeed. I think maybe you think about the premise of the question. So the very idea of ideologies is maybe questionable here, but if we examine the idea of ideology, so the Romantic ideology is, I suppose, emotion and trying to put into words the incredible feelings that human beings have. And if you like, the ideology of the Enlightenment is rationality, no nonsense, do things new, and get to the truth of the matter. Well, James, in my humble view, I think Charlotte does bridge that gap because she's doing both things at the same time. So yeah, I would say yes. I think she does help to reconcile those competing ideologies, if we think of them as ideologies. Personally, I don't. I think of it all of it as a kind of a soup of ideas, which by the late 18th century went into a kind of a frenzy as the arts broke away from the sciences, as it became clear that there wouldn't be a scientific way of doing politics or morality. As that became clear, I think it was kind of inevitable that there'd be that kind of divide. Okay, thank you, James.
Yeah, thank you very much. Charlotte's been kind of, well, I think, or I feel she's been kind of forgotten by 19th century writers and transitionists. Why do you think this is, and do you think that as well?
Well, she gets a mention through the 19th century by a few people. I'll give you an example. The Dublin Penny Journal, 1st of September 1832. there are very few writers, male or female, to whom we think Ireland owes a greater debt of gratitude than to Miss Charlotte Brooke, a lady whose patriotism led her to translate some of our most beautiful poetical remains, and whose talent enabled her to do them ample justice. So, I mean, that's lovely to see. That's 1832. But generally speaking, yes, she was largely forgotten as any. She'd usually get a mention by people, but she was largely understudied, underappreciated. I think maybe the main reason was just this difficulty of accessing her material in the end, maybe.
Yeah. Today, is there any monuments to Charlotte or any kind of
Good question.
somewhere where you can visit, or even her grave?
Well, it would be possible, I think, to visit her grave, all right. In Stephen, I believe it's in Longford. Is that right?
Yeah.
Forgive me for not being able to name the exact location, but yes, she has a marked grave, as I understand, and no doubt it's also possible to go to Virginia, County Cavan, and see where the estate used to be. And of course, Donegal Castle is the ancient seat of Basil Brooke, who was the first big Brooke in Ireland.
Okay. And isn't there a roundabout named after?
I think you told me that. Yes. Yes, thanks to you. I believe that's true. I think it was you that actually told me that. And I think I've seen a photograph of that. Yes, she is, I think since the publication of Lesse Niwungali's digital version of Charlotte Brooke and the new translation, since that happened about 10, 15 years ago, I think her reputation and appreciation of her is growing all the time. And there are lots of people far more qualified than me to talk about her linguistically, culturally, politically, in terms of romantic literature, in terms of Irish women, on all kinds of levels. We're finding that there is another woman coming out of the 18th century, another Irish woman.
Another layer that we need to really discover or rediscover.
Yeah, yes, and happily so, I think, because in my own study of Charlotte Brooke, I've learned a lot about our own Gaelic civilization, and also a lot about those ascendancy people and the complicated stuff going on in their heads at that time. It really seems it was just like one generation of people that went through that, So when we are reclaiming our enlightenment, we're totally, it's obviously right to focus on the United Irishman. But we even talk about Wolfe Tone. Well, one of Charlotte's subscribers was Wolfe Tone's secret dad's cousin, who was also a man who ended up getting assassinated by the United Irishman. But the connections in the Irish ascendancy and the kind of febrile nature of, I call it the soup of thought. I think it was very much in a, not a chaotic state, but in a very sort of fermentous state at that time. And I think there were people in the ascendancy who were toying with the ideas of Wolfe Tone.
Yep, definitely.
Yeah.
All right. Well, Francis, I think we'll close it down here, and thank you very much for coming on to Trasnatira and giving a talk for Reclaiming Enlightenment tonight. Excellent talk. I think we've all learned something new tonight. It's certainly new to me who she was before a couple months ago when you said you would be talking to Charlotte Brooke, And thank you for that. She's really is an Enlightenment figure, as well. I think she is anyway. The subscriber list that you sent me, I think it's for the second edition, was chock full of United Irishman names. Like, you know,
Yes.
I think there was like 5 or 6 pages, and within each page, I could see 3 or 4 per page. You know, and
Yes.
I was delighted to see that. And when was the second edition? Sorry.
So the second edition was 1816, and yes, Stephen, I look forward to you and I going deeper into this. So there is this very interesting thing. 1789 edition, it's full of the Ascendancy subscribing. 1816 edition, it's full of United Irishmen subscribing. So, so there's a change, you know, there's a big change in that period. Yeah.
It just shows that the union hasn't dampened that strive. I think it didn't dampen it.
That generation were still alive, you see.
Yeah,
they were still about.
Just to close, Mark Dockley's spotted something, and I think we chatted about it before. In the subscriber list, there's a Miss Yelverton, possibly the wife of Barry Yelverton, who condemned William Moore.
Yes, that's right. Quite right, Mark. And there's several of those despicable characters turning up in the 1789 list, I'm afraid. Yeah.
Another person who condemned R was George Casement of Larne, who's a relative of the famous Mr. Casement. But that'll do for tonight anyway. Francis, I think we've kept you on long enough. Thank you very much, everybody, for coming on tonight. Fascinating lecture again for Reclaiming Enlightenment. Okay, I'll just close her up now. All the best.